Chasing Lights. So I think in a lot of ways, we are all chasing lights, or we've all spent a lifetime kind of learning by having things happen that we didn't expect, or finding ourselves in an environment that we weren't really built for. And what I'm interested in learning from friends and colleagues is their stories, and how is it that they had to adapt even as they were running. It's almost like we're asked to adapt without having the right tools to do it, because usually we're adapting when we're 5 years old or something along those lines. I think that's certainly my story. As I moved, my family moved from Philadelphia to Alaska, and the clashes of culture and understanding and everything in the middle of growing up was fascinating, and certainly to a certain extent probably is a reason for why I'm so screwed up now, and how I see the world in a particular way, and whatever it is that I have, good and bad, to a certain extent comes from that experience, and comes from that almost jarring and at times difficult, at times amazing, wonderful experience. So I've asked a few people to spend some time really as part of the Chasing Lights discussion that goes beyond the book. What happened in your life, and how did you end up where you are? And I'm fortunate enough, for those of you that know him, Josh Harris, he is currently the executive director at Fordham University Real Estate Institute, has been engaged in the real estate industry quite a bit on both the academic side and on the business side, and continues to do so. I find it would be one of my favorite go-to economists. He gives me a really great perspective on where things are and where they're going. But that's the professional side. Let's just talk about the personal side and where that's going on. So, Josh, thank you for joining me on this discussion about your Chasing
Thank you,
Lights.
Gunnar. It's great to be here. And I have to say, I love that you're doing this personal book and this whole process. I think that one of the things, I know we had discussed this earlier, about how we all become sort of these veneers of our personal visages, right? If we go to our LinkedIn biographies, or even what's on a resume, and it's a very flattened sort of hyperbolistic perfection of what your career has been. And as a professor, right, I've always helped teach students to try to, we got to get out in the industry. I talk to people, and sometimes they get intimidated by people, and I say, there was a time when they were probably just like you. They didn't know what they were doing. They were unsure. They didn't understand all these things, and they didn't have all these successes. And oh, and by the way, when you look at that LinkedIn or their biography, it doesn't have their failures. It doesn't tell you about the battle and the hard fought war to actually get that position or get that promotion, or the time they got fired, or the business went under, or again, we go back into your high school growing up, and maybe the challenges they had to deal with. They may have had a similarly crazed upbringing, right? I mean, you might, maybe you get a line about how what they learned in military service or something else. You could probably guess that well, maybe they've seen some stuff, right? Like but for the most part, these things become biographical edits, and I think that the reality is we're all just way more complex and interesting. And I think that that's one of the most exciting things I just love about what you're doing on this.
Well, there's this wonderful quote. It came from the diaries of Soren Kierkegaard, uh, whatever the translation is from the original Norwegian. He said basically, life can only be explained after it has been lived. That
Wow, that's
we
deep.
we tell stories backwards. It's not that we are planning out the story. It happens the way it is. That we ever get ourselves to being kind of fully mature and fully skilled in everything, and we know the story and we play it out. First of all, that would be rather dull. You'd know exactly how everything works out. But we kind of take whatever the facts on the ground are from what has happened in the past, and we construct a story that we tell about ourselves. And by the way, that story changes over time because we keep reconstructing it. It's not just that we can change the future, we can change the past, and we do on a regular basis every time we tell it. So part of, I think, what you're talking about in terms of that LinkedIn
Yeah.
CV, you're right. It's not telling the whole story. It's putting together particular pieces to support a narrative, to prove a point. I know what I'm doing. I can succeed the next time I do something.
Right.
That you want to do business with me because this, and this happened. What I find interesting, though, is the amount of, it's not a lot of people who do this, but they're very successful when they do. when they talk to someone where they're trying to maybe get a deal done,
Right.
or they're trying to sell a product, or they're trying to raise capital, or whatever it is that they might be trying to do, and they almost start with where their failures were and what they learned from the failure. Now, to do that, I think it takes some courage, right? Or at least some
Confidence,
understanding
humility.
that you're going to be okay if you share that, right? But I do find that interesting, that in some ways is the most powerful way to connect with someone else. And it also is revealing a fundamental truth that usually takes people long past college to figure out, which is we are all flailing about. Everyone
Yeah.
is
Well,
trying to
this
figure out what's next, you know?
reminds me of a music quote from the great Avicii, who, I think, I hope I get this right. All this time I was finding myself and I didn't know I was lost. Right. And I think there is this thing that as you get older, you start to realize, well, okay, now I figure out maybe why I had this experience. And sometimes it is I know for me, look, I can't say I have a perfect understanding of how the universe or God or any of these other, whether it's a hard belief or a concept, how it all works, right? I mean, I think part of getting a PhD is you have a lot of curiosity about the world, and you begin to realize we know less and less about it, right? The deeper you go down the rabbit hole, the more unknowns you discover than actually answers you find. And I keep thinking something in my own life. It's like, well, now this makes more sense. Like why I had this experience, maybe even a very negative experience, often the negative experiences. Well, I get why I had it. Right now, it's helping me in this one time. I didn't know that this would maybe benefit me in the future, but now it makes sense. And I think that the duality that we present or don't present really, is something that we all should embrace. And so one of the things I like about your story that where I have a personal, I think maybe why I found this somewhat personally interesting is that, right, you were, still a effectively child adolescent, right? I think at the age when you moved to Alaska or were moved, right? I didn't sound like you had a lot of agency in this. I similarly I was in Fort, this is far less of a geographically interesting move. But maybe just as culturally disalignment, right? Because I was in Fort Lauderdale. I was born in Miami, grew up pretty much in Hollywood, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to effectively um, artsy, hippie parents. My dad
Right.
was a musician his whole career. What was in music? I don't. In fact, not none of my background. Do I have any of his gold records or platinum records and things like that that I have? And my mom was kind of the proverbial sort of hippie artist, kind of floater around it. I don't. She did modeling early in her career. She did like flight attendant, and then like different things, right? And they were sort of lost souls. So I some ways like me getting into the business world was kind of my rebellion of sorts, right? Because like
Right. You're sticking it to the
yeah,
man. I
right. I
like
mean,
that.
like,
I
yeah, I
like
mean,
that.
how am I gonna like? There were no amount of drugs or any experimentation that I could possibly do that my parents probably already had, and so it just wasn't cool. But my parents divorced and in their weird, and I think their connection was random, so I think their float apart was just as was random. But my mom had there was a new stepdad person who really hugely I think positive influence on my life, but he wanted to move out of this. Um, World of Fort Lauderdale and area, and he was kind of more of a blue collar type guy. And his family had started moving from the Miami-Dade, Broward County zone up to the Lake Placid, Sebring part of Florida, which is in the middle of the state. If there's a chance you've heard of Sebring, it's because they have the Sebring International Raceway that does get this, internet. All the Europeans come and race their fast cars on this really cool road track. Um, Once a week out of the year. Otherwise, it's kind of a proverbial cow in citrus town with not much else going on. But it does have some people from Tampa and Miami and Orlando and even Ohio who want to retire in a very cheap part of the town. And so I was drugged there. I think I started the eighth grade there. And, you know, Fort Lauderdale, Hollywood is about as metropolitan of a Florida city. It was kind of New York South. My dad was a New Yorker, so I was kind of literally the summer before this. I'd spent living in New York City at my stepmom person's, literally in this palatial residence at I think it was actually the Trump Palace on definitely on Third Avenue. This amazingly huge thing. So I get this like live in New York and the Upper East Side life. There was this really cool new place called Starbucks. They have these things called Frappuccinos, which definitely were a good idea for a middle schooler to ingest, but like we didn't have those in Florida yet. And now I'm being moved to the small place that literally a town that would be excited if they opened up a Taco Bell. Like that's literally how small Lake Placid was. They didn't have a Taco Bell. You'd have to drive to Sebring, and that could be someone's like date night. That I'm not making that as a facetious story. That was a real
No, no.
thing.
I mean, it makes total
Yeah,
sense. I mean, you're talking to a guy who's truly from the sticks. I get it. I think when we moved to Alaska, it was around 50,000
right.
people total in
Yeah.
Anchorage. So, I mean, do you know how big that town was when you
Yes.
moved
So
there?
in some ways, because of becoming a real estate economist and being a real estate person, I filled if I didn't know it then I filled in the blanks. But I believe at the time, and actually my stepdad person's his brother was a county commissioner at the time, so we knew a little bit more. I saw a little bit of the small town politics at play. I waved signs at the reelection campaigns and all that stuff. And I believe
Yeah.
the county in total of Highlands County was about 150,000 people. Lake the biggest of that was Sebring. We were on the outskirts. We were in the rural. We were in the rural electric territory. Like we were on 10 acres. We were on a 10-acre plot
Wow.
out there. We were probably 20, 30 minutes to like anything relevant. And Lake Placid
Okay.
itself had about 10,000 people. My graduating high school class had 150 graduates. I think our high school had 800 in total. Sebring probably had like 70,000 people in sort of whatever greater Sebring, and like Avon Park was maybe like 30 grand. So you had like 150,000 total. It's grown a lot. It's maybe at 250 now. I'm not so sure
Yeah.
about today, but it was kind of growing. You did have people were what we were doing, and in some ways it was a it's funny. It sounds like a theme that, boy, have I heard this recently. People were trying to flee big cities. If they had, in the case, it was of my sort of pseudo uncle who was the county commissioner. He was retired from the city of Miami police force, and he was in the Marines, so he had a pension and could kind of go anywhere. It was like, yeah, he was able to build a house on a lake. It was a gorgeously cool house, and so kind of like he had this amazingly cool house on lower income. Whereas, if you tried to do that in Miami, you would feel very
Oh,
poor,
yeah.
but I mean, he felt rich, right? And I think we all did. Like we had 10 acres, right? I mean, it was
Wow.
it started with a very tiny mobile home that came with it, and then we took a couple more years when we built a house. In fact, a lot of my influences in real estate, I had no interest. I thought I was going to be a computer nerd kid. That was like I was in the high tech magnet school at Parkway Middle in Broward County. And I mean, there's nothing like that there. And I know I'm learning about construction because we're building a house. We have family that work in the trades, and I help pull wire to build. Like I literally help build the house.
Right.
The things that at least they were trusting, like an eighth or ninth grader at the time. But the high school, like I remember like it was a big thing to take algebra in the eighth grade, and I was really concerned about my studies. I wanted to make sure, and they did a little test on me, and yep, I will put you in. I remember getting registered when I was getting registered for the eighth grade. Um, Show up there for the first day. And the woman who would end up being my science teacher was registering me to give you a small school effect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she says, "Okay, well, you're going to have math with so and so, and here's his classroom." I'm thinking, how does she know that that's going to be my teacher, right? Because that was the big thing. You had to go through the system. Well, there was one guy who taught that class. There was exactly one
Right.
class of
Right.
it, and of course you're going to be there. And it took me a long time to adjust to the culture shock. And yeah, I think in today's world, if we had high speed internet, or we did get satellite, we did have small dish satellite television, so it wasn't completely off base. We had dial up internet, so the whole hey, get off the internet, I got to use the phone. I mean, I know
Right.
kids these
Right.
days have no idea, but I mean, all the media and the radio, radio stations, all the things that were sort of my extended media universe. Even like the simple thing, like my parent, my dad always had a subscription to the New York Times, right? And I grew up in that kind of a household. My mom was sort of, she would carry the PBS tote bag, right? So like that was
Yeah.
y-
Yeah.
that didn't happen in Highlands County, and it was really interesting. And I think I
So,
yeah.
so okay. So let me get this straight. You went from two of the more kind of global
Hmm.
cities in the United States. Miami and New York, arguably very hot spots of kind of globalism. People from all over the world, incredible culture, incredible activity. Big
Hmm.
cities to a certain extent to this small town. What was the most kind of difficult adjustment? Where did you feel like, man, I'm a stranger in a strange land, to quote Heinlein?
It was interesting because, and I guess I'll say this gently but truthfully. In Broward County and in Fort Lauderdale, if you used the phrase country or even I think redneck or any of these things, these were pejorative things. You didn't want to be one of those. Like it was just sort of like not culturally cool. And because I mean, they had we had horses and cow territory at the edges of Broward County. Some people might be bussed in for the Magnifer for that, but I mean, that was high pride, right? Like Wrangler jeans were suddenly like this was a small cultural thing I remember that I
Yeah,
had no idea. This was not a thing in Broward County, but Wrangler jeans were a really big deal, and there were apparently different types. There was sort of the cheap version that you could just buy at Walmart, which I think I had a pair of. They were, we did. My parents. This was also kind of aligned with the time my parents were filing bankruptcy, so it wasn't like, I mean, look, I never went hungry. I never went. I don't want to oversell like a poverty story, but like you know,
right,
buying clothes at Walmart was a necessity as much as the fact that we didn't have a Neiman Marcus around town. But apparently, like if you to really be authentic, you had to have the kind of Wranglers that they had like a different tag, like a larger tag, and you had to
right,
buy those at the actual like feed store, Western wear store, right? Like
right,
they were more expensive. So the I mean like in Broward County, if you were in Fort Lauderdale, right? Your parents were impressed if they picked you up in a Mercedes or a BMW, right? Here
right,
it was like how many wheels and how big were the wheels on your truck, right? I mean, like if you had the dually tires, which like if those who don't know
right.
the two, like that was a big thing, right? I mean, I don't nobody had a European. If you had a European auto, you were a weirdo of some sort, right? I mean,
Well,
yeah,
yeah, yeah. You were
yeah,
suspect
it did
in
make
some
yeah.
way. Yeah,
It was either and like it was you were either Ford or Chevy, like and somehow Dodge was just like maybe a third randomness, and NASCAR was big, and it was funny. I actually the funny thing about it was this was like not my world. I actually was really enjoying kind of learning about it, and I found I will say that the kids and the people in the community were pretty open. I mean, this was a Lake Placid was not a closed area. So like there are some smaller towns that were that were much dare say poorer and they didn't really have they had no inbound migration. These were luxury areas. So like these were resort this like the way how if you're asking well, why did these family from South Florida pick this area? Well, there were camps they went to. There were the equivalent of lake houses. This was kind of a resort area. In fact, it was called Lake Placid, Florida, named after Lake Placid, New York, which obviously had the Olympics.
right.
So now this made for a lot of disaggregation challenges whenever I would explain it to my New York family. Like, wait a minute, they like, isn't that way up there in New York? Like, no, there's one in Florida. And then the craziest thing was there was a movie that came out in the late '90s called Lake Placid about like killer alligators that actually took place in Canada. Like it wasn't even in and 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 what we had alligator lakes. I mean, like well, all lakes in Florida
Right.
have alligators, but I mean, and then the only thing that they did at some point when I think when the movie was coming out on like home video back, remember those things, video stores? They actually did do a this is real. They did a publicity stunt in Lake Placid, Florida, where they actually had an alligator being like walking a red carpet into the movie gallery in downtown Lake Placid. So I mean, so like it was really, but it's funny because of this name. Like all of a sudden, people like knew people didn't know where it was, and but the community was open to a lot of outsiders. I mean, I had one of my favorite math teachers in high school, and his he taught like a whole like practically all of us college bound kids classes, and because his daughter was actually in our graduating class, he put a lot of effort in on our like ran a lot of extra SAT prep classes and stuff like this. He was from a small town in Maine, and what I learned this is something interesting, Gunnar, from a little bit into our real estate professional side is that there are all these networks of people that basically move from small town to small towns, right? The same way that people might
Yeah.
relocate from LA to New York, or then, from Dallas to Houston or to Atlanta, or, Orlando to New York, like kind of like, city to city transfers. There's people that move from like small town Georgia to small town parts of Florida. If I tracked even my high school friends that are on Facebook, they might end up in a small town in Tennessee. Sometimes that's because they met somebody at college. Like it's the people from small towns sometimes move to other small towns. a good number of us actually did leave. I mean, in fact, actually, one of the most you want to talk about family connections, right? Which I would imagine this is probably a theme in Alaska that, when you graduated high school, right? You basically, if you wanted to leave, you might be driven in this, if you wanted to leave, you had basically two routes. You could go to college, which is the route I took, that did require good grades and potential money, right?
Yeah.
Which is, the educational system not as strong as it would have been in Fort Lauderdale, and just college. There was a good chance you were going to be a first time in college. Like your parents, at least in my generational cohort, didn't on average go, unless you were like one of the town lawyers or doctors or CPAs, and that was a minority. Or you went in the military. So like a lot, I know we graduated the year before. I'm sorry, like months before 9/11. So I had a lot of people who were in it, and like that was the way you got out of the town. And then a lot of people resettled. Now, myself, all the college kids, for the most part, never. I would say it's not very few of us came back who went
Mhm.
there. Now, ultimately, I wasn't really from there, so the fact that I didn't move back shouldn't shock. Ultimately, my mom moved to St. Petersburg, so I only have friends there. I don't really even have any strong. I don't have so much of a strong connection anymore. But I, it is one of those parts of America that I'm very grateful that I got the chance to live with, and I think, I got to see. I picked up skills. Some of the experiences you have, like the fishing and some of these other stories, like I had my own airboats. For us, was airboats was one,
Oh
four
yeah.
wheelers,
Yeah.
ATVs. Got to shoot all kinds of guns. I mean, I'll throw in a little bit of controversy. I remember I was in high school when Columbine happened, right? That tragedy,
Mhm.
and there was all these discussions about, oh my God, could there be these high schoolers that have access to firearms, right? And what does that mean? And it's like, if we're sitting in class, like, all right, what do you got? I've got two ARs. I got, like, everyone's like, I've got, yeah, everyone's like, the collect, like, this was not an unusual thing. I was sort of gifted sort of a single shot shotgun was my only thing, which, a little four. If anyone knows shotguns, a 410 was, might take down a quail on a good day, right? That was sort
Right.
of it. It
Right.
was for sport and fun like that. But I mean, it was interesting. It was one of those things where I do think some of the cultural divide. I I think it gives me an interesting perspective, and certainly even this was very useful in the real estate business because it's all about humans and people, right? And the physicality that they need to interact with. People are different, and I think it helps to understand people. And if I didn't have this sort of cross cultural experience, I don't think I would have the same contextual understanding of the world that is loud. I think one of the reasons, if I have any great skill as an economist and like, it's because I think I in part have lived amongst or have a better understanding of the full sum totality of the people of which we are trying to come up with statistical inferences for and then make investment decisions to serve, et cetera, and so forth, right? As opposed to if I just grew up in my little suburb of New York I used to live in and went to, a
Yeah.
fancy high school and a fancy college, I may never have seen that other world the same way.
It's interesting to me though, because on the one hand, you said that all these people are different and these things are different, and yet you're also saying at the same time that they're the same. So think about your conversation about Fords and Chevys and how many tires do you have in back and whatever else. That's a hierarchy that's set up within a different
Oh
culture,
yeah,
which is not dissimilar to that suburban New York where the school pickup line, everyone has a Mercedes or an Audi or whatever. But it's all a kind of important hierarchy in terms of, do you have the right genes, do you have the right whatever. That it doesn't matter at what level of the socioeconomic spectrum you're on,
right.
you're going to be playing that game because that seems to be a human thing that we
Mm.
do. And it's something that we're not exactly proud of as human beings, that's what we do, but we do
You
that.
know,
And then secondly, I love your observation in terms of small towns, big town. I mean, part of what surprises me is that we still think it's amazing when people move in their life. And yet, so many people do. So many people are in a different place than where they started, especially if at some point your life was interrupted by military service, going to college, taking a new job somewhere else. That, there's, by the way, there's a reason why the college kids don't come back to that small town. They're not going to be,
good.
very few of them are going to be able to get a job that is commensurate with what their
Yeah,
education is.
it's
It's reality. The same is true for Alaska. A lot of us didn't go back. I have I have a whole network of friends that are from Alaska, and we don't live there right now. It's not that we don't like it; it's that to do what we decided to do, impossible. And college was our ticket out, or in some cases, the military was another. And military is actually a form of college.
Yeah.
It's an environment where you are exposed to something completely different, where you're asked to do something that's really unpleasant and difficult and challenging. And I'd argue, even though people do have a lot of fun in college, that I think a lot of the kind of the core what you're trying to do is hard. It's embarrassing, it's awful, you're going to fail. And I would argue that people in the military have a good time too. It's just, in the context of learning how to deal with, life and
It's
death,
it's like that
literally.
hero's journey concept, right? I've
Right.
taken huge. I love that that story and that sort of human connection metaphor that you almost have to go on these adventures to the other world or the weird world and sort of fight your way back, pick ascend to get the prize. And
The worst thing we can do, no matter where you live or, what circumstance, is to say there is not an issue, or we're better than everyone
right,
else, which I think it's a human tendency. I'm not saying, people are bad for doing that. I think there's a tendency for us to not want to look,
right,
to not want to deal with what is uncomfortable and what is, what is less than awesome about,
yeah,
human behavior, about history, about ourselves, about things that we've done without even realizing it. And I agree with you. In the South, or at least in North Carolina in the 80s, what I was seeing was people dealing with it
yeah.
more. It was out in the open more
Mhm.
than what I saw in the North. Now that's always changing, and I'm speaking in broad
Sure.
brush here. It's different with different people, different sub communities, etc. But I do think there is something to be said for not being able to
Mhm.
deny, not being able to create a bubble around
Yeah.
yourself. And to a certain extent, in the small town, you can't hide in a small town. Everything's
That
kind of out
that's
there.
exactly what I was actually gonna say that, is that you had to be friends, you had to like, you couldn't not service certain customers. I mean, you were there was this necessity of the world, and, it's actually one of the things when, obviously, I remember being politics feel more splintered in maybe the last 10 years than they did. Maybe that's not even fair. I mean, people didn't like George Bush, like, W back then. Some, who knows how historians will really review when all the emotions and all this is gone, but, I remember because obviously, a place like Highlands County, I do remember some of the political breakouts. I did, you know, someone lived in a bit of a political family, so I want to say like Bill Clinton's reelection. I think I was there for that or was in there. I want to say it went 60-40 Republican Democrat, and that was kind of an average split, which is a hard lean, right? If you're a political person, but it's and I want to say that for Trump's elections, um, so I did went. I mean, my curiosity, I had to look. I think they were closer to like 80% Trump, 20% right. And I mean, and I remember when I would see some of the commentary about that, I said, it's like I don't. I always thought it was like really wrong to broad brush these people of these type of towns and areas as racist or these. I took a lot of it. I mean, not direct offense. I took like, is this misunderstanding? I like that is not why they're voting. That's not why they're doing this. Like, and there's been a lot of I do understand like even that I that phrase resentment. I mean, I think that the small towns, and I think small towns in Florida are probably like small towns in Pennsylvania, even if they're very different industry or different, different histories and all these things. People who kind of live out there, and I know one of our discussions about the Hunger Games, and there's these headquarters, these like shining, these superstar cities, right? I mean, we can think about how we do. Look, at AFIRE, they have the list, right? And the ranking of cities. The ULI has their master, goes down to like 100. I don't know, they get over 100 in total cities to get ranked. Obviously, Sebring, Florida, and its little micropolitan statistical area will never show up on any of these rankings. I don't even know how much, if you tried to find the institutional real estate, they actually, by the way, the retail there is phenomenally performing. I would invest there, interestingly. But these areas, people who I do think the people who've grown up there or really from there, they do somewhat know and recognize that they are a little bit looked down upon by the people in the bigger cities, and not necessarily just New York. That could be like Orlando, Tampa, Miami, right? And look, if you even to this day, like I'll think about something medical services. So, uh, one of my friends in high school's daughter had I think it's just an ongoing has some pretty serious healthcare items. I think even involved having to get an organ transplant, right? And there, this story has been told on Facebook, and they have to take the daughter to Miami, right? Like Jackson Memorial. They are within a couple-hour drive, getting probably some of the world's finest medical care, which is an amazingly great thing. But you have to leave, right? I mean, there is a sense that that these are different worlds, and they're looked upon. And I think about, um, they're separate, but they're incredibly integrated. And I think that that's one of the things that always bugs me a little bit, that these areas, and I have to imagine Alaska has to feel this a lot, because they are. I mean, you're literally like, you don't even get to. You're in half of the country, and I mean this like a joke, but I'm sure it comes up like, think Alaska is somewhere hanging out down beneath Mexico, right? Because of all the
All
insects
right.
on
Those stupid maps. Yeah.
right,
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Wait a minute. Yeah, like look at a globe, right? But these areas are, we are connected, and we are sort of, look, as an economist, right? We're the same monetary policy, the banking system. I mean, there's a lot of heavy linkages, certainly laws and things like that. And look, when we go to war, a lot of I mean, I remember throughout all the Iraq War, uh, there would be these, the memorials would find out would. I mean, because people from Highlands County were absolutely being injured. They were certainly serving over there, being injured, and absolutely people lost their lives. And
Right.
I've had friends who've on full disability from their Iraq War service, who've lost. I don't have any. I can't. Thankfully, I don't have anyone I can, like, a close personal person I know who lost their life. But I mean, I know people who have family members and significant others who did. And like, they're in for the common cause. I mean, they're mobilized as much, for our, the defense after 9/11 and those type of things, um, as ever. In fact, and I think some of the linkages, like, the patriotic moments, like, so one of the members, I think, one of the very patriotic experiences I've ever had was watching the space shuttle launch. Now in
Hmm.
Highlands County, because of, like, the lack of light pollution being out there, you could see these very well. Just the distance to the Cape Canaveral was pretty good. And I remember when, John, do you remember? This had to have been probably late '90s, maybe 2000, when John Glenn went back up as, like, a passenger astronaut.
Hmm. Yeah.
He was obviously very old, and the whole school, they brought us all out into the parking lot so that we could all watch John Glenn's shuttle launch, right? And everyone is cheering and exciting. It's one of these very connecting moments, and that's something I think we all. I assume probably people across the country. Now, obviously, if you weren't in Florida, you probably didn't get to, like, see it from your backyard. Um, and I have to say, the space shuttle launches were incredible. The SpaceX launches, which I can see from my home in Florida, they have nothing on what that space shuttle was. Like, they just do not
Yeah.
carry the same heft of a rocket launch.
Huh.
But that was a but those were universally coordinating moments, and I think
Yeah.
that that sense of shared, connection to everybody was very universal. And I actually remember 9/11 being an incredibly, like, that is the one moment where I most remember everybody from that town. I was already in college. That's where I felt like we were all the same. Like that, and I when I would go home and see people there, like what happened to New York, um, caused massive pain to people there in very real
Yeah.
and visceral ways. Even if they maybe didn't know a single, they may not have actually known a soul who actually, perished or was directly impacted, but
Right.
they felt
Right.
as impacted.
Well, part of what I'm wrestling with, I think, and the writing of this book has given me more reason to chew on it and to think through it. But also my work in real estate. As we look at different metros, we
Yep.
look at the connections and the economics of cities, is that I think if you look at it in a certain way, the division that we've created between the city and other small town,
Yeah.
rural, even suburban, that these are not inherent divisions. We've created them. That to a great extent, whether you're in Lake Placid, Florida, or you're in Manhattan,
Mhm.
you're connected to the same city.
Mhm.
It's not a geographic city, but it is, we are all kind of feeding in the same ecosystem. We're all gathering information and stories and
Yep.
products and services that we are all creating, co creating, whether we're in the middle of nowhere or we're in the center of all the action. and we're all kind of in this kind of soup of our
Oh,
culture, that we're, we have perhaps a slightly different perspective on it. But I would argue, and take this as someone who lived 5,000 miles away from where you lived when you were growing up, that you sitting in Florida
right.
were part of New York.
Yes. Well,
That is so connected,
and I,
and so was I, and I didn't realize it. And this was
yeah.
before the internet,
See,
long before the internet.
this is,
We were still
yeah,
connected to
this is
what
where
you
the
were
internet.
doing.
This is what's so crazy, and I think the actual implications of this are still being digested because this is not as in your face. But in the '90s, the cultural trends, like we had cable. You might, if you were lived in close town, you had cable. Now satellite television was pretty ubiquitous with DirecTV and the small dishes, but that had only been a couple years. Like in fact, I don't.
Yeah.
I think if that DirecTV hadn't been invented, I'm not sure that my as many of my South Florida friends would have been willing to move up there. I think that technology actually said, all right, we can live here because we'll get. I'm not kidding about this because like they were way cheaper than those. Remember the gigantic, like I forgot what they
Yeah.
call
Yeah.
the big dish, which I'm sure you had. I'm sure those were big in Alaska because for the same reason.
I'm pre-dish.
Free dish, yeah.
So,
I'm
no,
not
no.
trying
I
to.
mean,
Yeah,
literally,
yeah,
literally, when we first moved up there,
right,
the nightly news with Walter Cronkite was broadcast the next morning
right.
because someone had to take the tapes up from Seattle on an airplane up to
Just
Alaska.
to
That
reach.
was
That was how.
pre.
Yeah. So we had,
Yeah,
and
we weren't getting
well,
satellite
we
feeds.
had
It was
in
direct.
and this actually caused me like a lot of frustration because I thought just from looking at the map that Lake Placid should have gotten South Florida television and radio, that they should have like
Mhm.
re-amplified up there, but they didn't. We were in the Tampa Bay media market, right? So yeah, we were getting all the, which I guess was geographically closer. So for weather news probably made sense. But nowadays, ex post, if in 2025, they are part of the TikTok trends. They are, I've the Facebook, like they get the cultural sensations that hit in New York can kind of hit simultaneously in Orlando. They can hit in Highlands County. But I remember, in fact, I remember going when I was certainly in college and I'd go home more often and these things. What could be like a fashion trend or a societal, there was like a definitive time zone where like you knew it probably started like in New York or in LA. It filtered to like the Orlandos and Tampas and the Charlottes. And then it would take more time before it possibly could. So like something could get to Highlands County as a trend after it was already kind of passe in Orlando or certainly New York. Nowadays, like they're part of the news cycle, they're part of they're part of the political, the cultural cycle. Um, there's dare say they don't even get the differences. And I actually know this is one thing I learned when I first moved to New York in 2017. Right, so I was in Orlando for all this time. Now, one of the things that amazed me about how all my friends, like I had far more friends from wherever, certainly in Florida, whichever city, they would see me in Manhattan because they were always coming up to visit. Like people in Highlands County and Orlando visited New York for vacation, or Orlando a lot more for business in addition to vacation. But um, they were going out ice skating. I mean, they were doing all the touristy stuff that I wouldn't do because I mean, no actual New Yorker, like I said, nobody in New York actually goes to the Empire State Building, right? I mean, like, or the except for me who works there, right?
Yeah.
When I worked for the couple of years when I used to work there, like I went there because I had a I had a I had a pass to my office, but there were the Statue of Liberty or any of these things. But all my friends are up like. Like they were coming up, and I would tell people, I said, well, listen, if you're coming up, there's a good chance your hotel is going to be in walking distance or close proximity to one of my offices. So text me, call me, whatever. And so I'd often would see people who lived in Florida more frequently than I might see social friends or even family members that lived in other parts of New York because I'm commuting out to Long Island. Well, I'm commuting up to Westchester, and God knows we don't want to drive there on the weekend. It was awful. So it
Yeah.
was something that those connections are. I think they flatten themselves a lot, and I mean now that there is this like whole like Starlink technology, right, and like literally sort of high speed internet technology. Like there's a chance. I don't know if your book will, if this podcast or this book will get more heavily adopted in Alaska, given some of the context. But there's a possibility that someone will watch this interview on a Starlink in some small town that is only reachable by float airplane. Right? Like there is a
Right.
possibility that. Where the probability that a content like this could even be recorded, let alone distributed, 15 years ago impossible? I mean, and I
Well, I mean, I wonder because part of what I saw growing up was not necessarily that we didn't get the same stuff
right.
that you would get on the East Coast.
Mhm.
It's just the timing would
Yeah,
be different. And now we have more instantaneous, some delay still. The farther out you go, there is some delay. You can still spot
mhm.
when you're in a California airport, you can still spot the flights coming in from Alaska. You can still see that they're a little out of sync, in terms of, their clothing or whatever else they're doing. It's a little
Interesting.
out.
Yeah,
Probably not as extreme as it was 20, 30 years ago,
right.
but it's still there.
Interesting because the cultural elements, and by having lived in, think about the place I've lived. I mean, like I grew up, I was pretty young in Miami. Miami's a weird place. Like it took me a while to realize, like in Hollywood Beach, Florida, wait a minute. Like going around the world, it's like you don't have shirtless guys on unicycles with boa constrictors just coming like, because that was a pretty normal thing to see on any of the beaches down
Right.
there. But apparently
Right.
that's pretty unique there. And it'd be really weird if you did it in any part of, well, any place else. Yeah,
Right.
you should do it down Fifth Avenue. I'd love to see it, right? But I mean, so there, and then obviously like Placid, Sebring, very different. Orlando, which actually is a really interesting eclectic city because it was almost it was almost even post civil rights in its growth, right? I mean, what grows Orlando? Everyone thinks of Disney, and yes, Disney is very important. The tourism industry is important, but actually, it was the space industry, and it was like engineers,
Yeah.
and like it was actually it was almost dually influenced by NASA and sort of somewhat post World War II, Cold War. Like we made a lot of missiles and stuff like that. Still do in some of these factories that are here, and then of course New York, which is the melting pot of the globe. I mean, look, it's the center of the universe, right? I mean, you can argue. I mean, people in London want to argue one thing. I mean, we all of us semi New Yorkers, believe something else, and and then coming back around to these things, and I think about how there's so much more interlinkage of all these places and such interesting kind of connections, and I find that the world is probably more monoculture than it ever wants to admit, right? It's just different dialectical flavors, right? I mean, it's sort of like
Hmm.
it's like I'll use an app metaphor of like think about a some eclectic international buffet restaurant, right? That has all the different like we're really all in the same restaurant, right? We're just sort of by thinking that we are sort of isolated, that we are this varietal is a false sense of connection or false sense of almost a dichotomy that doesn't exist. And I
Right.
am impressed that I think smaller towns are getting somewhat of a resurgence in this like internet connected, low latency period, right? Where we're like how are we really connected? Gutter, I'm assuming you're in the DC area today. I am in Orlando today. The truth is, we're really connected by some data center, which might actually be closer, might be close to you, right? It could also be up in Ohio. It's
Right.
possible it's
Right.
in Dubai. I don't. Who knows where the software that we're using today is actually going to process all this stuff, or it could be being split and fractionalized and all of it, and almost like in a like some form of Heisenbergian process won't be recombinated until you hit some download feature to re-upload it for final purposes, right? That's the world we're in. Geography is
Right.
split, and this is a little bit the topic of some of the book that I'm working on in these 30 looking at city sizes, and I think that there is something about the scale and size of how we want to live. And if I have any complaint about New York, and I love New York, I'm not a anti New Yorker. I certainly, from an investment, I would never tell someone to bet against it. And like every someone who wants to talk about the downfall of New York, I'm like, yeah, I mean, like buy when you can. If you're lucky enough to you probably will have you probably will have missed out if you didn't take advantage of these periods. But I do think about it was so hard to move around. Like I didn't live in New York. I lived in a small section of Westchester County centered around New Rochelle and the Scarsdale area where our house was. And it was really painfully difficult to even get into the city. And look, dare say maybe if I had, a different salary or income level, I could have afforded a different life, maybe in the Upper East Side or Upper West Side that would have maybe changed my perspective. But, with kids and all, all the logical parameters wasn't possible in Orlando. This is one of those weird things I realized. When I live in Orlando, I live in Orlando every day. Like in a single day, I can get all around. I can get to the north end, the south end. I can even get down to Disney basically within about 30 minutes, right? I mean, and that's including even with the concept of traffic or rush hours. That's impossible in New York. Like I remember trying to set meetings with friends or even business contacts. We're like, you know what? Let's just do this on Zoom. There. You live in some part of New Jersey. I'm in Westchester. I could end up taking 2.5 hours or at least 2 hours each direction just to find a common place for us to meet up for like a 30-minute coffee meeting. And that's just sometimes I hate to say, Kaylee, not worth it. I can get in my car and zoom around cities like this, and I think that there's something about I've heard this phrase human scale. We started talking about, literally 15-minute cities with their cars and bicycles. There's something that I think our big cities have somewhat failed us on interconnectivity. We just have not kept our infrastructure, our transit up, uh, anyway to make it worthwhile. Before you even get into like safety or affect or
Right.
like
Right.
which and then that maybe get a little overhyped, but it's still
Well,
legitimate.
I think to a certain extent,
Yeah.
we tend to look at symptoms versus root causes, right?
Yes.
So when things are breaking down because something systemically isn't working, you're going to see those conflicts
Yeah. But
emerge. And it does seem to me that to a certain extent, we've maxed out on the infrastructure that we thought was appropriate for a city. So we've been pushing up against the upper limits of
if the
what can be
Second
done in New
Avenue
York.
if the Second Avenue subway expansion is
Yeah,
if that's the best we can do, we can't do anything, right? Like there is the expense of that is beyond reproach. But it does it. But to make this a positive, I think this is more positive than not because if we're able to kind of accept that you can have these amazing lives, even dare say a very high end career, right? Which everyone can. That means something different to every single person. Like I know for some kids,
right.
if they're not at Goldman Sachs, their life somehow failed. I mean, I had college students who were like that. And like it's
Yeah,
still, we laugh about it, but there are certain like undergraduate students at very prestigious universities who literally have this like do or die. If they're not in a bulge bracket top tier thing, they somehow are a
failed. Yeah.
disgrace to their family. Like they literally believe
Hmm.
this, and which is sad in its own right, and that's worth its own discussion. But I think that the ability to have be it in Cincinnati, be it in Orlando or Salt Lake City, in any of these number of cities, for me, so long as you got a good airport, I'm very much in the Aerotropolis mindset. Like so long as I've got an airport that I can get to where I need to get to internationally, nationally, I'm as interconnected because candidly, the bandwidth, I mean, I have gigabit fiber at this house and other, I think so increasingly, there is a day where now look, my wife is not from the Lake Placid or Highlands area. She grew up actually in Tampa Bay area, actually technically born in Boston. I don't think we will, maybe one day we'll find a way to have a lake home. Possibly, I don't even know if that'll happen, but there is a chance where people like me or people like you who are, we're knowledge workers, right? Where that's fundamentally that you will actually see more and more of us, I think, literally living in cities like Lake Placid, like Hudson, New York, or Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. I do think that we are going to disperse ourselves because we're just connected by technology in a very different way. And if you really want a human scale life, I mean, I have to say that the way that the people, certainly when I was in high school there, and I believe it's still true today, even with technology, things change. The ability to know each other and to kind of have that sense of home and that almost a little bit of sense of community, I think we're missing that in a lot of our big cities. I think that's one of the things that the classes of us that like work in these professional zones because we're always commuting or traveling, like we're not connected to the community in the same way that I think people who are just more rooted into
Yeah.
their background are. And I'm not saying that look, New York's
But
not going away. Yeah, but
I would argue that isolation is really the issue. That whether you're talking about being in a large city
right.
that where you're having to spend all your time isolated in transit, or you're in a suburban or rural environment where isolation becomes a very real thing too,
Sure.
especially if you're spending most of your time isolated in transit. That, the enemy of a healthy,
Mhm.
fulfilling life, there's many enemies to that, but one of the main ones, I think, from a mental health standpoint, from your ability to grow, learn, do more than what you could do by yourself, is not being isolated. It's being connected. And
Yeah.
isolation is not just geographic. So we tend to think of it purely in geographic terms when the most successful, I mean, you are naming communities that are communities
True.
You're not naming places that are truly isolated.
Right.
So real isolation happens in small communities, mid-sized communities, and massive
Right.
communities. And isolation is the problem. Loneliness, isolation, not being connected to other people. And you can be isolated in the middle of, 5 million people. That is entirely possible and is
There was
actually
a great New
kind of
York
the
Times article about that exact concept. I won't be able to cite it, but
yeah,
about how like you can be in this big part of this large apartment complex in New York City and not know a single neighbor by name.
right. Right. And to a certain extent, the technology, as much as it's allowing someone who's fortunate enough to live in some beautiful, idyllic place, but still function with New York City and Hong Kong and London, whatever else, as great as that is, this technology can also very easily draw people into an isolated existence. That we need that connection, whatever that connection is, and we need to learn how to do it again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I would also argue, by the way, that every time we have a new communication technology, it takes us 5 to 10 years to figure it out, at least, and that we have a lot of problems with it in the meantime. I mean, everything from the Gutenberg Bible to radio and television and
Yeah.
film to satellite to all these different things. Every time that comes in, our society freaks out. You think the Gutenberg printing press would have been nothing but awesome. They printed Bibles. Now everyone can have Bibles, and people all are learning how to read. But you also had 100 years of conflict in Europe, all based on people, reading something that was nailed to the church door and deciding that everyone else was evil, obviously inspired by the devil. So we need to kill them.
I think
So,
there is isn't there a biblical story about the Tower of Babel, right? And
well,
there's
there you
something right
go.
like
There you
how
go.
like we
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. So we find ourselves right now in an environment where instead of disagreeing with each other, we believe that the other side, whatever side you're in, and this whole side thing is
Yeah.
arbitrary as well, is evil, is out to get you, is going to destroy you. And as long as we're in that context, we're going to have more and more conflict, more and more
Tribalism.
danger.
What you're
Tribalism, danger. But that's enabled by new communication, new tech that we don't understand. So we read a Facebook post that confirms our worst fears, and we flip out, and then it gets amplified.
Well, the other
And
isms are
that's
this. What you're describing is sort of there's almost a need to define your tribe or a tribe you're in, and then but you can't be a tribe unless there's another tribe, right? Like it doesn't. You can't like I mean, if the Jets don't have the Sharks to fight, right? I mean, well, are they or right? I
yeah,
mean, like if the Crips don't have the Bloods, if they don't, I mean, none of these things
yeah.
like you can't. And there's actually interesting. This is both in economic literature, somewhat in game theory. I mean, I will say, doing a PhD that involved a heavy part of behavioral economics is probably life changing in ways that even if I didn't really pursue that as like the career side of my life, but yet there's so many times where actually politics is I think political science has most where it's almost like when you get to where like one party or thing just completely kind of dies off or becomes so marginalized they have no power, and then you have like a unipower system, it almost has to refracture itself to become dipolar again. Like it is this weird genesis of things that there's no defeating of it. And I don't know, political consultants, I think, make a careers on this because clearly, if we all disagreed and functioned simplistically, I mean, how many lawyers and how many political consultants and even media types would have nothing to do with their lives, right? I mean, they'd have to learn how to paint or something. I don't know. It's that's which I think is a little bit, and not to even think about any of our current political personalities, but I do think there is something about artists, business people, and sort of non-politicians becoming politicians that intrigues me. And I will say, even growing up, when I in local, not even just like Lake Placid but even in Orlando, I think that small town politics don't usually get the same sort of they can become extremely contentious, but they're always on usually practical bounds. Like, I hate where you're going to put the sewer pipe. Like, and
Right,
why
right.
do you hate it? Because I'm going to see it, right? They're there's something about the mundane, but also incredibly personally tact. In fact, I remember going to, I guess this was more like not an HOA, but it was a meeting with a city. This was like, I don't know why my parent, I think I wanted to go. Just must have been a weird kid interested in city governance and real estate issues when I was way too young. But this was in Broward County. I remember going to this um, localized meeting, and I'm assuming someone from the county was there talking about this drainage pipe system. And we lived on these little lakes that were right in Broward County, not very working class neighborhood. And I remember this one guy, incredibly hot and upset, sailing up to telling him that they were going to install something called a French drain, which I have no idea what this actually is. I've never really heard this phrase ever again in any of my real estate life. I'm not an engineer. Why should I? Telling this guy from the county that he could take this French drain and quite graphically describe where he could shove it. And I'm thinking to myself, and I kind of laughing. I think I'm a sixth grader at this. I'm like, what? Like, this makes no sense. And I think about this, like, this is a pipe. It somehow was really upsetting this guy that it was going to be installed, or the wrong thing was going to be sold somewhere in his property. But it wasn't about there was no Democrat Republican split, no liberal consult. There were none of the things that are that get everyone hot and bothered today. But this guy just but the amount of, I mean, he had every bit as much acrimony as you might see on a CNN panel or something like this, right? About this drainage system. And I'm just thinking to myself, let's assume you're the neighbor who didn't pay attention to the mailing or whatever it was that invited this meeting. They'll come in. You'll just one day, I'm sure some city worker you'll see a men working here sign. They'll install this thing, and you'll have absolutely no idea what happened. Even if you're there's something about, why do I bring this big story? Is that there was a lot of bliss and ignorance about just the world happening around you and having no idea that it was happening around you, right? But
Mm,
now, like, if something horrible happens, like Russia invades their neighboring country, Ukraine, something that, does it bother it? Does it affect us? Does it not? Is it this global? Like, you write all these contexts to it, but my golly, we see the videos of it, right? We actually
hmm
we hear the voices of Ukrainians, and we think about this, and suddenly we are personally invested into this thing in a way that I don't think 20 years ago we would have had the context. I don't think the Bosnians or any of those things had any. There's like the
mm,
Rwandans. Like, there's lots of. I mean, there's bad stuff that happens in this world, right? I mean, that part of humanity hasn't come close to ending, but we're part of it, right? I mean, we are now suddenly part of it. And when I think about my own upbringing of all these different geographic connections, I do think that one of the reasons, and I'll let you tell that story, but about part of your own family's reason for Alaska was like you were getting away, like you're sort of like, we're running, like, we're not going to hear about it anymore. Like, we are going to be away from the impact, away from the news. Can you do that anymore? I mean, can you off grid anymore? And I mean, I guess you can always just, it's funny. I think you could probably have a TikTok feed, or a Twitter algorithm, or whatever they call Twitter X. I don't know, whatever you call these things anymore. I feel like you could probably have an algorithm that more or less shows you cat videos and not political videos. But I think that we are so much more connected in a short way, and I worry about that. If that really, if the isolation effect of the news, right, and let alone people, or vice versa, like you're isolated, like, not a single person who lives in your apartment complex, whatever city it's in, but you are sort of entwined with the daily happenings of people thousands of miles around the globe. Here's a phrase I've never heard this phrase used in any way until now. But it has to do with podcasters or people like this, where one of the reasons why they think podcasts are so popular and all these sort of internet personalities is people come to have what they call parasocial relationships with them.
hmm hmm
Have you heard this phrase,
Yep.
parasocial? Like, which
Yep.
is like basically saying that you feel like you are a friend with Joe Rogan, or
Right.
what's the Young Turks, or I'm trying to pick one from the left side. Like, these are people that you've never met. You might be a subscriber. They likely have zero idea that you exist, only in the sense that you are one of the X millions of subscribers that they have, and it generates these views, which generates ad clicks and revenues and all these things. But yet you believe that you know this person on an intimate personal level, because not only are they telling you the news, they're also updating you about their children or their daily happenings, and so you're getting kind of this. parasocial belief that you're part of a network and a world and a community,
Hmm.
but you are technically as isolated and distant as possible. And maybe that I think that works more easily in a bigger city where you sort of see people in Lake Placid, at least certainly in the 90s. I mean, unless you were literally going to be a shut in your house, which I'm sure people did and could be, right? I mean, that happened. You were going to go down to a hardware store, and there are only so many people that were going to be in there. Like it was really hard to hide, right?
Yeah.
In a small town,
Yeah.
it's harder to hide. But we have
Hmm.
worlds now where, be it from digital communications, it's really easy to hide. I don't know. I definitely encourage people. If I was talking to a student who's graduating from college these days, especially with AI on some frontier of disruption, and opportunity too. Everyone talks about the disruption. Everyone talks about the opportunity because we know how to define disruption because it means the end of something. Opportunity, the creation of something we don't know how to define.
Right.
And those who do know how to define it, will become proverbially what we like to call billionaires, right? That is a little bit of that's a little bit how that works. But I would encourage a kid, you know, look at simplicity, like find some of the nostalgia connection, like be happy with maybe you know, find a way to be happy in your own simplicity. But that's so easy. That's such advice that's so easy to give and hard to follow.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the things that I love about. That's why I think that's why I love this project you're doing, Gunnar. I think that it is somewhat of a connection to simplicity
Hmm.
and something that we all should find that's why that's I think that's the individual connection we should all have, right? We should all find our connection to this and our crazy lessons, and it doesn't have to be running being CEO of a Fortune 500 company.
No, it might at some point.
Might,
You
yeah,
never know. But
someone's got to do that too.
someone's going to get that job, but
Yeah,
it's not necessarily that's not the goal. We are certainly. I mean, thank you for kind of circling this around so beautifully. It is. We are all chasing
yeah,
lights. The question is, is it the chase? Is it the capture? Is there ever a capture? And I would argue probably not.
probably not.
That may be the end when you do capture the lights, when you go through that.
That's
But
deep. That is deep.
it. But I do think there's a central kind of humility and an
Yeah.
understanding that there was a wonderful radio announcer in Chicago, Lynn Bramer, that he was someone I had a parasocial relationship with. I listened to him every morning. But he would say, passed away just a couple of years ago, but he would usually after the news would come on, and it was usually a terrible news story. It always is, right? And at some point before the commercial break, he would say, "It's great to be alive." And he meant it. And I think that I keep going back to that. Things kind of suck. It's
Right.
great to be alive. How do we sit there on that commuter train to Westchester, which is miserable? And how do we feel good about where we
Yeah.
are? How do we embrace the miracle that we're just,
Mm,
we're in this?
right.
And, the career is an illusion. A career happens despite our best efforts, that, it happens. The most important thing is, where are you right now?
Yeah.
And are we, in this chase for light, are we able to truly appreciate the chase for what it is and not worry so much about whatever the picture is at the end?
I love that. I love that.
Anyway, well, we've burned up an hour and a half of time here. This has been an amazing conversation, Josh. I really appreciate you taking some time on this, and I'm looking forward to more conversations,
Love it.
especially as we publish the book at the
Yes, it's
beginning
very
of
exciting.
2026.
Incredibly exciting.
Chasing